Welcome back to UrbArchitect, the channel where we dissect the city, understand the built environment, and celebrate the ideas that shape our world. I'm your host, and this is our brand new series, the Architecture Podcast. For our first episode, we're tackling a giant. But before we even say his name, let's picture something. A typical city street. The skyscrapers of glass and steel, the open-plan lofts, the apartment blocks raised on pillars, the flat roofs used as terraces. These elements feel so familiar, so normal that we barely question them. But they weren't always there. Much of this architectural DNA comes from one incredibly influential, controversial, and brilliant mind, Charles-Édouard Gris, whom the entire world knows as Le Corbusier. His work is so foundational that to study modern architecture is, in many ways, to have a conversation with him, whether you agree with his ideas or not. Over this series, we won't do a simple chronological biography. Instead, we'll dive deep into the powerful thematic pillars that support his colossal legacy. We'll explore his work not as a sequence of buildings, but as a set of revolutionary ideas. And we start with the most fundamental concept of all, the house as a machine for living in. This phrase, published in his seminal 1923 book Towards a New Architecture, was a deliberate provocation. In the 1920s, the word machine was charged with meaning. It represented the future efficiency, precision, and the sleek beauty of ocean liners, airplanes, and automobiles. By comparing a house to a machine, Le Corbusier wasn't advocating for a cold, inhuman existence. Quite the opposite. He was arguing that our homes, the places where we live our lives, should be as thoughtfully designed, as functional, and as beautifully resolved as the finest engineering objects of the age. He saw the chaotic, ornate, and often unsanitary housing of the 19th century as obsolete, a relic of a pre-industrial past. He asked a radical question. If we can engineer a car to perfectly serve its purpose, why can't we do the same for a house? This philosophy demanded a complete break from tradition. It required a new architectural language, a new set of grammatical rules. And this is where Le Corbusier, together with his cousin and partner Pierre Jeanneret, delivered his most famous and enduring manifesto, The 5 Points of a New Architecture, formulated in the 1920s. To understand why these 5 points were so revolutionary, we need to briefly step into the world he was reacting against. Mainstream architecture at the time was still largely dominated by load-bearing masonry construction. This meant thick walls, small windows punched into heavy facades, compartmentalized rooms, and sloped roofs. The form was dictated by the structural logic of stacking heavy materials. Le Corbusier saw the potential of reinforced concrete, a material that could be poured into forms, creating slender columns and flat slabs that were incredibly strong. This technological shift wasn't just about a new material, it was the key to a new freedom. The 5 points are the systematic unlocking of that freedom. First, the pilotis. These are the slender, reinforced concrete columns that lift the main body of the building off the ground. This single move is a profound inversion of centuries of architectural tradition. Instead of the building being rooted to the earth with a solid, often dark base, it is raised up. The ground floor is liberated, becoming an open, continuous space that can be used for a garden, for parking, or simply for allowing the landscape to flow underneath. The building visually floats, achieving a sense of lightness and dynamism that was previously impossible. It's a dramatic shift from a fortress-like foundation to a permeable, open relationship with the site. Second, the free facade. Since the building is now supported by the grid of pilotis and internal columns, the external walls are freed from their load-bearing duty. They are no longer structural. The facade becomes a thin, lightweight skin, a simple envelope that can be designed independently. This separation of structure and skin is a cornerstone of modern architecture. It allows the architect to compose the exterior based purely on aesthetic intention, the need for light and functional requirements, rather than structural necessity. Third, the ribbon window. This point follows directly from the free facade. With no need for solid wall sections to support the weight above, windows can run horizontally across the entire length of the building. These long, uninterrupted bands of glass flood the interior with uniform, diffused light, a stark contrast to the localized, often gloomy light from traditional vertical windows. The ribbon window also creates a panoramic connection to the outside, framing the landscape as a continuous picture. It emphasizes the horizontal, the machine aesthetic, over the verticality of classical architecture. Fourth, the free plan. Inside the building, the same principle applies. The load is carried by the grid of columns, meaning the interior walls are merely partitions. They can be placed anywhere or not at all. This liberates the interior layout from a rigid sequence of box-like rooms. Space becomes fluid, open, and flexible. Rooms can flow into one another, and the function of spaces can change over time. The free plan is the ultimate expression of the house as a flexible tool for living, a direct translation of the machine concept into spatial experience. It's the reason why so many modern apartments and offices feel so open and adaptable. Fifth, the roof garden. Le Corbusier saw the traditional pitched roof as a useless, wasted space. His solution was the flat roof, which could be transformed into a functional terrace or a garden. For him, this was an act of ethical and ecological restitution. By building on a piece of land, you are destroying the natural ground cover. The roof garden was a way to give that green space back to the inhabitants and to nature. It became an additional room, an outdoor living area that offered privacy, sun, and views, reclaiming the footprint of the building itself. The ultimate, almost clinical demonstration of these 5 points is the Villa Savoy, built in Poissy, France between 1928 and 1931. This house is the textbook come to life. A pure white box lifted elegantly on a grid of pilotis, its facade defined by a continuous ribbon window that wraps around the curved upper level. Inside, a free plan organized around a ramp leading to a spacious roof garden with sculptural curved walls. The Villa Savoy is not just a house. It is a manifesto in reinforced concrete. It sits in the field not as a building rooted to the spot, but as an object placed there, a machine for living that is both precise and poetic. It perfectly encapsulates the first major phase of Le Corbusier's work, the purist period, characterized by geometric clarity, white surfaces, and a belief in universal, rational solutions. But for Le Corbusier, designing the perfect house was only the first step. The real challenge was much, much bigger. What happens when you try to apply these principles not to a single villa for a wealthy family, but to an entire city? What happens when the machine for living becomes a machine for urban life? That ambitious and deeply controversial leap is where we're headed next. Welcome back. In our first segment, we explored how Le Corbusier redefined the very essence of the individual house with his 5 points, creating a machine for living. But for a mind as vast and ambitious as his, the single-family villa was merely a prototype, a test run for a much grander, more audacious project, the complete reinvention of the city itself. If the house was a machine, then the city was the ultimate industrial complex, and in the early 20th century, Le Corbusier saw that complex as a catastrophic failure. The historical cores of European cities like Paris were, in his eyes, chaotic, diseased, and obsolete. They were a tangled web of dark, narrow streets, overcrowded with dilapidated buildings, choked with traffic, and devoid of sunlight and green space. He described them as Stone Age settlements, utterly unfit for the new machine age. His response was not to propose gentle reforms but to call for a radical surgical intervention. He famously declared, "We must refuse to allow the slightest concern for the past to influence our decision. There is no solution to be found within the city as it exists." This philosophy of tabula rasa, the clean slate, would define his urban theory and become his most contentious legacy. His vision crystallized in the concept of the Ville radius, or the radiant city, first presented in the 1920s and fully elaborated in the 1930s. The radiant city was a utopian blueprint for an ultra-rational, ordered and hygienic metropolis. It was a city of strict zoning and separation of functions. Imagine a vast, open parkland. Rising from this green expanse are identical cruciform skyscrapers, spaced far apart from each other. These are the unites, the self-contained vertical cities for living. Each one would be 200 meters high, housing thousands of people and containing all the necessary amenities. Shops, schools, laundries, and social spaces, a direct application of the machine for living on a colossal scale. The ground level, freed up by the towers, would be dedicated entirely to transportation and recreation. Multi-lane highways for fast-moving cars would be elevated on pilotis, completely segregating vehicular traffic from pedestrians, who would roam freely and safely through the continuous parks below. The city would be divided into distinct sectors: the business district, the industrial zone, the cultural and entertainment center. This, for Le Corbusier, was the city of light, air, and greenery. It was a vision of salvation from the urban squalor he despised. The most famous and infamous illustration of this plan was the 1925 Plan Voisin for Paris. Le Corbusier proposed demolishing a vast section of the historic Marais district north of the Seine and replacing it with his grid of 18 cruciform towers. It was a deliberately shocking proposal, a manifesto designed to provoke. Unsurprisingly, it was never seriously considered for implementation. However, the ideas behind the Plan Voisin and the Radiant City proved to be incredibly influential in the post-World War II era. As European cities lay in ruins and needed rapid reconstruction, and as governments around the world sought solutions for mass housing and urban growth, Le Corbusier's principles offered a seemingly scientific, efficient, and modern answer. The legacy of the Radiant City is therefore a profound and deeply paradoxical one. On one hand, it inspired a generation of urban planners with its noble goals: to provide sunlight, fresh air, and green space for every citizen, to eliminate slums, to create efficient infrastructure. On the other hand, its practical application often resulted in some of the most criticized urban environments of the 20th century. The large-scale housing projects, or estates, built in the UK, the US, and elsewhere, borrowed the ideas of tower blocks in parks and separation of traffic, but they frequently failed to recreate the social fabric and the sense of community found in traditional, organically grown neighborhoods. They often became alienating, monotonous, and socially problematic. The Radiant City model is accused of being impersonal, scaleless, and of disregarding the human need for complexity, intimacy, and historical connection. It represents the dark side of modernist utopianism, a top-down, one-size-fits-all approach that sometimes sacrifices human experience for abstract ideals of order and efficiency. This is the essential dichotomy of Le Corbusier's urbanism, a vision that promised a radiant future but, in practice, often created landscapes of concrete and social isolation. Yet, even as he was developing these grand urban theories, Le Corbusier was also obsessed with a more intimate human-scale problem. If the city was a machine and the house was a machine, how could you ensure that every single part of it was perfectly scaled to the human body? How could you introduce harmony and beauty into the very dimensions of the built environment? His answer to this question was a lifelong passion project, a personal quest for a universal standard of beauty. He called it the modular, and it's where we turn our attention next. If the 5 points provided the grammar and the Radiant City the epic narrative, then the modular was Le Corbusier's attempt to write the poetry of architecture, a poetry based on mathematics and the human form. This brings us to perhaps his most personal and fascinating obsession, a quest for a universal system of proportion that would bring order, harmony, and a deeply human scale to the chaos of the modern world. Le Corbusier was deeply dissatisfied with the metric system. He saw it as an arbitrary, cold, and impersonal measurement, divorced from the human body. How could you create buildings that felt inherently right and beautiful using a meter that was defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole? For him, this was absurd. True harmony, he believed, had to be rooted in human anatomy. He was inspired by the proportions of Renaissance masters like Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, and the golden ratio found in nature and classical architecture. His goal was to create a modern scientific equivalent. After years of development, first with his assistant Hanning in the 1940s, he unveiled the modular. So what exactly is it? The modular is a scale of measurements based on the proportions of a stylized human figure. Le Corbusier defined this figure as a 6-foot-tall, approximately 1.83 meters, man with his arm raised to 2.26 meters. From these key dimensions, the height of the solar plexus, the top of the head, the tip of the raised hand, he generated 2 overlapping Fibonacci sequences, a red series and a blue series, all based on the golden ratio, approximately 1.618. This created a complex but coherent set of measurements that could govern everything from the grand dimensions of a building to the precise height of a kitchen counter or a door handle. The idea was profound. Any object or space designed using the modular would be inherently harmonious because its proportions were mathematically linked to the human scale. It was a tool meant to bridge the gap between the objective world of engineering and the subjective world of aesthetic feeling, to ensure that modern architecture, for all its efficiency, would not lose its soul. The ultimate and most comprehensive application of the modular is the Unite d'Habitation in Marseille, France, completed in 1952. This building is a masterpiece that synthesizes nearly all of Le Corbusier's ideas up to that point. It is, in essence, a vertical village, a machine for living for 1,600 people. It contains 337 apartments of 23 different types, along with an entire internal street of shops, a hotel, a kindergarten, and a spectacular rooftop gymnasium and pool with breathtaking views. But what makes the Unite truly extraordinary is how the modular dictated every single detail. The ceiling heights, the width of the apartments, the size of the windows, the layout of the kitchens and bathrooms, all were determined by this proportional system. Walking through the Unite, you can feel this intentionality. The spaces, though modular and efficient, have a surprising warmth, variety, and rhythm. The double-height living rooms in some units, the cleverly designed built-in furniture, the play of light and shadow in the corridors, all of this is a direct result of the modular's influence. It prevents the building from feeling monotonous or impersonal. The Unite also marks a dramatic shift in Le Corbusier's architectural language. Gone are the smooth, white surfaces of the Villa Savoy. Here he embraces béton brut, raw, unfinished concrete. The formwork marks are left visible, giving the massive structure a textured, rugged, and primal quality. This was not just an aesthetic choice. It was an ethical one, expressing the truth of the material and the process of construction. The Unite dehabitation is the culmination of Le Corbusier's work in Europe, the application of his urban theories in a single building, organized by his system of proportion, and executed with a new, powerful materiality. But his journey was not over. The final chapter of his career would take these evolving ideas, the raw concrete, the monumental scale, the search for profound symbolism, to a completely different continent and culture. It was there that he would create some of his most poetic and powerful architecture, moving beyond the machine to something timeless and spiritual. That journey takes us to India. The final, and for many, the most profound chapter in Le Corbusier's career began not in Europe, but in the foothills of the Himalayas. In the early 1950s, he was invited to design the new capital city for the Indian state of Punjab, to be named Chandigarh. This was the closest he would ever come to realizing his urban visions on a grand scale, but the result was astonishingly different from the glass and steel towers of the radiant city. Confronted with the intense light, extreme heat, and rich cultural tapestry of India, Le Corbusier's architecture underwent a dramatic and powerful transformation. He moved beyond the pure machine-like rationality of his early work towards a language that was monumental, sculptural, and deeply connected to the earth and climate. The government buildings he designed for Chandigarh, the High Court, the Secretariat, and the magnificent Palace of Assembly, are not machines. They are modern temples, primal and eternal. They are constructed primarily of raw, brutal concrete or béton brut, but here the material is handled with unprecedented expressiveness. To combat the harsh sun, he designed enormous, deeply sculpted brise-soleils, sunbreakers, that shade the vast glass facades. These elements are not merely functional. They create a dramatic play of light and shadow that changes throughout the day, giving the buildings a living, breathing quality. He incorporated massive, sloping ramps that force a slow, ceremonial pace of movement, and courtyards that channel cool breezes. The scale is almost mythological, evoking the grandeur of ancient Egyptian or Mayan architecture, yet the forms are utterly of the 20th century. Chandigarh represents Le Corbusier, the architect-poet. It is a synthesis of all his principles. The 5 points are reinterpreted on a colossal public scale. The modular informs the proportions, and the vision for a functional city is realized. But it is infused with a new spirit of symbolism, texture, and a response to place that is absent from his more abstract European plans. It shows an artist who had evolved from a revolutionary polemicist into a sage, creating an architecture of experience and emotion. So, what is the final verdict on Le Corbusier? His legacy is arguably the most complex, consequential, and contested in all of modern architecture. On one hand, he is a titan who fundamentally reshaped our world. He gave us a new architectural language based on light, space, and freedom. Concepts like the open plan, the free facade, and the roof garden are now utterly commonplace, a testament to the power and permeation of his ideas. He championed the use of new technologies like reinforced concrete and prefabrication. He forced architects and society to think big, to consider the city as a whole and architecture's role in improving human well-being on a societal scale. He was a visionary who dared to imagine a radically different future. On the other hand, his legacy is deeply shadowed by the unintended consequences of his ideas. The top-down, tabula rasa approach of the Radiant City inspired urban renewal projects that often resulted in alienating, socially disastrous housing estates that failed to create community. The brutalist architecture he pioneered, while powerful in his own hands, was often copied without his sensitivity, leading to buildings widely perceived as cold, inhuman, and oppressive. He has been criticized for a certain arrogance, for believing that his universal solutions could be applied anywhere, regardless of local context or social patterns. The lesson from Le Corbusier, therefore, is not to worship or to dismiss him, but to engage critically and continuously with his work. He forces us to ask essential, difficult questions that are as relevant today as they were a century ago. What is the true purpose of a house? What is the ideal city? How can we harness technology and rationality without losing our humanity? How does architecture relate to social justice? His work is a permanent provocation, a body of thought filled with both sublime masterpieces and cautionary tales. He remains the indispensable reference point, the architect with whom every subsequent architect must have a conversation. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Le Corbusier on the first episode of the Architecture Podcast on UrbArchitect. We've journeyed from the 5 points of a villa to the plan for a city, from a mathematical proportion to a monumental capital. His story is a reminder that architecture is never just about buildings. It's about ideas, ambitions, and the endless, flawed, and fascinating pursuit of a better world. Let us know in the comments which architectural giant we should explore next. Until then, keep looking up and keep questioning the world you see built around you.